Human cognitive abilities. They are incredible, and none of us can fully grasp or understand them, because the moment I'm convinced that I can shape things myself, when I realise this, whether as an individual or as a company, I automatically gain optimism, simply because I can shape everything myself. We need to take all these cognitive skills that a human has, maybe not every single one, but at least create a framework so that the robot is able to learn on its own.
We travel across Germany to speak with experts from various industries. Today, we're in North Rhine-Westphalia, in the city of Dortmund. Our guest is Timo Landener, who recently joined Körber and is now responsible for innovation management there. Welcome, Timo.
Thank you for the invitation, and welcome to Dortmund.
Timo, thanks again for taking the time to join this conversation. Many already know you as a very versatile person. Although you have now been working in the logistics industry for almost 20 years and have gathered a lot of experience, not many people may know that, besides your main job, you are also engaged quite a bit in other fields. Among them are futurism, sociology, philosophy, and climate research. Which area do you feel strongest in?
Which area do I feel strongest in? Let me briefly explain it from a different perspective. Basically, I believe we should all have much more humility toward things that we do not know. Therefore, I would never call myself an expert in any field. On the other hand, I can place this in a context. For example, in logistics, because there is relatively little future research, future studies and future-related work happening there. By that, I don't mean the near future, but the far future, actually. I would say that when it comes to future research and future scenarios, I definitely possess some expertise in the logistics sector. But once again, if I compare and put it into context of real futurists, I would still say that I'm not really an expert in that area, because I'm not. In fact, I'd say I'm more of a self-taught learner. So it always depends on the context. And for me, it's important to always say that I have great humility about what I don't know, and I try to keep working on expanding my knowledge. But I would say that my focus and expertise lie more in the area of potential future scenarios.
The world is changing rapidly. Every day brings new innovations. Keeping up with those changes, not always easy, but staying ahead, absolutely essential. Artificial intelligence today, something even bigger tomorrow. But what truly drives your business forward? Andersen is here to spot challenges, analyze them, and solve them, with solutions that are precise and dependable. No in-house developers required. We provide the expertise, 17 years of experience, a trusted partner to leading global companies. With over 3,000 IT experts, we're ready to move your business forward. Follow the link to get your free consultation. And if we project this specifically onto logistics, what skills are important when you work in the logistics field?
As a matter of fact, logistics is very diverse. We can talk about transport logistics or intralogistics, but I think the big challenge in the industry is this. Logistics creates a huge amount of value. And by that, I don't just mean monetary value, but societal value as well. Because without logistics, we wouldn't get the goods we need every day for our lives. Of course, there is also a negative side of logistics in this area, meaning overconsumption and the like. Nevertheless, this value is not really recognized or accepted socially. Also, I always have the problem when someone in my private life asks, "Where do you work in logistics?" Then I have to explain what it actually is, because everyone knows logistics, sure, no question. But the implication behind it is usually, I drive a forklift or I drive a truck. But logistics is much, much more than that. So the logistics sector faces the challenge of making the concept clear first. We need to explain what it actually is and what correlates with this. is that the monetary value of logistics is actually very low. That means all companies engaged in this sector are extremely margin-driven, and that's true for all companies worldwide. That's clear to me as well. But in logistics, it's 2 or 3 levels more pronounced. And in that context, leading a company or managing a company is a difficult balancing act. The reason is, in my field of innovation, it sometimes causes real conflicts.
You have also worked in the field of intralogistics for many years. I believe digitalization has really changed that area as well. What kind of innovations do you currently see emerging in intralogistics?
Well, first of all, digitalization is still in full swing. I'd put it that way. There are still many areas where a lot needs to be digitalized. Even in logistics, the fax machine is still very much around.
Yeah, that's still true.
And there are also so many software providers in this field. They're all promising improvements, and yes, digitalization is in full swing indeed. I can't say exactly where we are right now in logistics, but there's definitely still plenty of room to grow. That much is clear. When you asked the question, I think the first thing that came to my mind, and probably to everyone listening as well, was, well, artificial intelligence is definitely the key topic at the moment. And I actually see it the same way. The potential that could come out of this is, well, I can't even fully wrap my head around it, to be honest. I just know I can't map it out on a timeline. And that's the fundamental challenge of innovation in general. When is the right time, and how do these developments unfold? But I believe when it comes to artificial intelligence, we are really just getting started, especially in areas like pattern recognition, for instance. In logistics, we're sitting on massive amounts of data. That's something I used to see quite differently just a few years ago. The thing is, this data is often very unstructured and locked away in silos. And when I imagine a situation where this data becomes accessible in some usable way, and I can apply smart algorithms, pattern recognition, or whatever else is possible, then there's enormous potential there. I honestly can't even fully imagine what all might be possible. That's the area of data availability. But then there's also software development and everything that goes with it, or just pure process improvement in everyday office work, like writing offers or other tasks. These are all massive opportunities, not just in logistics, by the way. There are clearly some things that apply across all industries, and I really think it's going to have a huge impact, both on us as individuals and on the professional world in general, just like the internet did. And that's something that I see as probably the biggest disruptor in several areas right now, alongside digitalization itself.
In one of your podcast episodes, the term microfulfillment came up. I think not many people really understand what that means. Could you explain it a little?
Microfulfillment is a topic that really took off during the pandemic. The trend has cooled off a bit since then, but that's no reason to assume it's going away. It's going through a hype cycle. These things come in waves, and it will definitely rise again. As the name suggests, microfulfillment is a fulfillment concept on a small scale, focused on more compact operations. This applies mainly to dense urban areas. The goal is to make goods available locally and to bring them to the customer on the last mile in a really efficient and timely way as well. Microfulfillment, in that sense, starts right there, in city environments, with a small, let's say, warehouse setup, just so people can picture it, where products are not only stored, but also prepared, packed, and picked for the person who, for example, placed an online order. From there, you can build out different concepts for how goods actually reach the customer, whether that's through last-mile delivery or something like curbside pickup. I drive somewhere in my car, I've ordered something in advance, and I just collect it because someone has already picked and packed it for me. That was something that really surged during the pandemic, especially in the grocery sector. For obvious reasons, of course, people naturally wanted to avoid stores to reduce the risk of infection, so that ties in closely with the rise of e-commerce in that space. And it's also why things have slowed down a bit again, because now, of course, people are going back to supermarkets. so we've seen a bit of a dip. But it's also important to note that this varies from country to country. Take online grocery shopping. Consumer behaviour in Germany is totally different from what we see in the UK, the US or China. And beyond that, the infrastructure here isn't really ready or ideal for micro-fulfillment. In Germany, you'll often find an Edeka right next to an Aldi, just as an example. And maybe next door there's a Rossmann. And then just 1 kilometre down the road you've got a Ruwe, beside a DM and a Lidl. That kind of dense and overlapping retail makes pure play online concepts much harder to implement effectively. So why would I bother ordering online if I can just hop on my bike and visit the supermarket in 500 metres? I think in the future though, it's still a very interesting concept, organising fulfillment specifically for e-commerce in urban areas. And that's really what the whole micro-fulfillment idea is about. A quick side note, there are also multi-hub models. That's not about supermarkets at all. It's more about efforts coming from cities and municipalities, trying to restructure how fulfillment works in urban areas. The idea is to avoid situations where, say, 3 different delivery drivers ring your doorbell on the same day, because you ordered something from Amazon and then from somewhere else too. So the question is, how do we consolidate that better so that maybe just one delivery truck or van or e-vehicle comes into your neighbourhood to complete the last mile? And that's very much in the interest of cities and municipalities, especially in light of efforts to decarbonise urban areas. From a technology standpoint, it's essentially the same setup. Whether you're talking about grocery fulfillment centres run by Rewe and Edeka, or whether you're looking at a public multi-hub system, the tech is the same. It's about consolidating goods at the edge of the city and organising the last mile from there. The only real difference is in who's driving the effort. On one side you've got the commercial players, and on the other it's the cities and local governments.
You have briefly mentioned international differences. If we come back to the broader term of logistics, what would you say are the typical characteristics of the logistics sector in the USA, in Europe and in Asia? Can you give us a general sense of the key differences?
Well, if you compare the United States and Europe, Europe is densely populated. The US has vast open spaces. Just look at how big their distribution centres are, regardless of where exactly they're located. In Germany or Europe in general, warehouses tend to be built upwards, vertically. In the States, they're built outwards, horizontally. That alone is a major difference. So the USA simply has more space to work with than Europe. Europe is packed, densely populated and so on. That's already one clear distinction. Then of course, cultural aspects play a role as well. Americans are much more failure tolerant, and you can see that in areas like innovation and startups. In Europe, we're still more cautious and focused on return on investment, on having a solid business case. We tend to plan for the long term, whereas in the States they often take a shorter view, and that naturally impacts how systems are designed. Over there it's more like, we know what our business will look like in 5 years, so we'll plan for that now, rather than making huge investments in fixed intralogistics systems that would only pay off over, say, 15 years. You can see small, flexible automation solutions compared to the big heavyweights we have here in Europe. So culture is also a very different topic. Take China in terms of food. If you look at the food sector, in Europe there's a long history, formerly family businesses, now large consortia. China has no tradition in this area, so there's no food chain that has been operating for 80 or 90 years on the market. That is a completely different playing field for micro-fulfillment in China. And the big e-commerce chains have also entered the food sector there, like Alibaba and JD.com. You couldn't imagine that here because we have this great tradition. That is, on the one hand, good tradition, but on the other hand, tradition also somewhat hinders progress, but just as a cultural summary. So this obviously has a massive impact on logistics, because Alibaba and JD.com, when they're in the food sector, come from the micro side, a completely different mindset compared to the classic heavyweights, like we have in Germany with Edeka and Rewe, for example.
And how do you think the warehouse of the future might look? I know it's more about imagining possibilities, but anyway.
Yeah, when I look ahead to the next few years and try to imagine that, I think we won't see futuristic warehouses, But what we will definitely see, well, I hope at least, is that logistics halls, the warehouses of the world, will also be used for other purposes. For instance, we can use them for renewable energy, placing solar panels on the roof, for instance. And the interesting thing about these models is not only that companies can supply themselves when the sun is shining, for example, also this could work with those battery storage systems. If they continue to improve, then at some point we will actually be able to have a kind of perpetual motion in place. That is, energy will be fed almost directly from the sun into the warehouse and then maintained by the battery storage systems, supported during the hours when the sun is not shining, so that energy is still available. What I mean is, such a solar power system on the roof of a warehouse can also supply the surrounding houses or other facilities with energy. Definitely, business models will arise from this. It's not just that they can supply themselves, but if the sun shines strongly or for a long time, the system will produce more energy than the warehouse can possibly consume. Therefore, one should always consider the following thing. Okay, how can I then distribute the energy that I feed in there via the sun locally?
Timo, let's talk about robots a bit. How far can robots, especially combined with artificial intelligence, be used in a logistics warehouse or in logistics processes in general?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest disruptive topics in logistics, in my opinion. We already have robots in use today, though not everywhere, of course. Robots are still an investment for companies. For example, we have robots that move on the floor. These are the so-called AGVs or AMRs that carry shelves on their backs and bring them to a person, who then picks items from them. Afterwards, that robot returns. Amazon bought this technology years ago when they acquired Kiva. So these are parts of robotic solutions available today. Then there are also depalletizing robots. Item picking robots are worth mentioning as well. So robotics is already in use in many areas. The reason I call this the biggest disruption is that at present these tasks are each handled by separate, specialized types of robots. An AGV handles carrying, an item-picking robot handles picking, and so on and so forth. And we are already witnessing significant developments, and these definitely go beyond logistics. Tesla, for example, is thinking about android robotics and working on that. I believe there's truly disruptive power in this area, especially for the logistics industry. Let me mention just one fact. Last year, in 2023, at Modex in the USA, a logistics company even presented an android robot for warehouse automation. There's still a long way to go before we actually see those machines in operation, and I can explain why I see this development as a complete disruption. The thing is, if we take an android robot, not necessarily looking like a human, I don't want to imply that, but one that can perform the functions a human does today, these robots already do that. An AGV carries something, an item-picking robot picks something, a palletizer stacks pallets. They all perform these functions, and if I imagine an android robot being able to take over these functions, then eventually it will make all these other technologies obsolete. I'm not saying we'll stop seeing AGVs soon, just that one robot could take over all these tasks. And what's crucial here is, if you combine that with another important current trend, which is sustainability, construction will become more expensive. So building new warehouses will get costly. Also, the amount of existing space that remains unused will continue to grow. Offices, for example, are becoming emptier. We can already see that. This, of course, started with the pandemic. Once office capacity was planned for 500 employees, but the pandemic hit and now it looks like only about 250 desks are needed, because some employees work from home, not all 5 days. That means there's a lot of space currently unused, just sitting empty, and if building gets more expensive, then we will have to make sure these spaces can be used again. So if we take warehouses that you don't need to build from scratch, just need to automate, there is something to think about. We're in demographic change, building costs are rising, and there are skilled labour shortages, whatever the case. And I don't want to rebuild my warehouse. Maybe I just can't afford it. That's quite typical. For instance, I've had so many conversations with people from the logistics sector who said, yes, we actually need to automate, but we can't afford it. We can't rebuild our hall to fit big cranes or large conveyor systems or whatever. So then I imagine throwing a robot into such a setup. And in this case, I wouldn't even have to change anything about the infrastructure. Such a robot could operate a pallet jack, for example. Or, exaggerating a bit, it could even hop on a forklift and drive it. I don't really believe that now, but if we think about these potentials, I don't have to change anything, just bring it in. And then I have automation in place. That's the part where I think, okay, these Android systems really have huge potential to become truly disruptive one day.
Yes, I think theoretically this could solve the problem of the skilled labour shortage, no doubt, especially in the logistics industry. And it is quite obvious that there are so many missing workers in logistics nowadays. On the other hand, aren't we risking over-automation in this case? I mean, could jobs, especially those that aren't well paid at the moment, be completely replaced by robots? Or will those jobs just shift somehow? How do you see that in terms of societal development?
So first of all, regarding the timeline, that's really quite far off. I've just explained it. But the question I often get is, do I actually believe that in 20 years people will still be working in logistics? My clear answer is yes. They definitely will still be working in this sector. But it is a transformation, and some jobs will go up, others will go down, and maybe in 50 years, who knows what will happen? Maybe in 50 years only robots will still be running around and working in warehouses, but I can't predict something like that, of course. That's exactly what I have already mentioned about the timeline. That's why I don't think this will lead to higher unemployment, because I believe that some jobs will simply die out naturally. And we have seen things like that happen so many times in the past. Certain jobs have disappeared completely, but on the other hand, new jobs have emerged and exist now. And we're witnessing that again, especially when we look at demographic changes. We have a massive problem in skilled trades. The education pyramid is completely flipped. What I mean is, 50 or 60 years ago, the majority of people attended lower secondary schools, and only a small part of the population, let's call them the elite in quotes, their children went to high schools or grammar schools. Today it's completely different. A smaller portion goes to lower secondary, and the majority attend high schools and then move on to university or whatever else. As a result, we now have fewer skilled craftsmen, but we always see this shift with certain professions dying out. Like I said, the example with craftsmen is a negative one. Of course, I don't want them to disappear at all. On the contrary, I'd love to see more and more such professionals among us, because the value of craftsmanship is really important and vital for any society. And we've totally messed it up, so to speak, by giving the craft such a bad image.
What role do you think artificial intelligence plays in this process?
Well, when I think about the essence of robotics, I'm absolutely sure robotics without artificial intelligence is basically impossible. I'm truly convinced of that. You can clearly see this interdependence in the logistics industry, and it's even more apparent in other sectors. What I mean is this: human cognitive abilities, they are incredible, and none of us can fully grasp or understand them. We have seen proof of that ourselves during development, when we fail to notice things that humans just do automatically. Let me give you an example from item picking to illustrate this. Say you have a container that's completely packed with small boxes. It is so tightly packed that there's basically no empty space left. And now the task is to pick one of those boxes. A human, without thinking, just reaches in, pushes the surrounding boxes aside with the back of their hand, and pulls the one out. No problem at all. A robot, on the other hand, stops and doesn't know what to do. And that's just one small example that shows how unaware we are of everything a human being can do. There is much to think about. Now, sure, you could say we can just program all of these things we notice during development in a deterministic way. Good luck with that. You could spend ages programming it all, or you might as well take artificial intelligence, in this case machine learning, as part of artificial intelligence. In this case, you will tell the robot, just learn, do what you think makes sense, try things out and gain experience. Kind of like dealing with a small child really. You have to learn for yourself, find the best way eventually, test things out and so on. That's why I'm saying it won't work without that, because we need to take all these cognitive skills that a human has, maybe not every single one, but at least create a framework so that the robot is able to learn on its own.
Timo, we're now out here in the city, and we've talked about the use of robotics in logistics. Where else do you see potential for robots in an urban environment?
In an urban environment, if I approach it from a different angle, I don't really see robots being widely used for last-mile delivery in the near future. Things like drones and such, I don't think that's going to take off in the next few years, to be honest. But I do think robotics will make its way into other areas outside logistics. We're already seeing some examples of that, in hospitals, for instance. Now, I'm not talking about surgical robots, I don't really believe in their rise either, but we clearly have staffing issues in healthcare too, like with nursing. And that doesn't mean nurses should or will be replaced by robots, but nurses don't just provide care, they also do a lot of other tasks, like transporting things, moving beds around and so on. And those kind of tasks, that's where automation could definitely play a role. What I'm getting at is any task that's repetitive and doesn't require close interaction with people. That's prime territory for robotics of all kinds, definitely. And I'm sure we'll be seeing more of that in the future. What is also important is that we need to think about the demographic shift and our response to it. This shift is not just something that'll happen next week, but over time. And for society to adapt, it makes sense to phase out some of these repetitive tasks. Of course, this has to be managed politically as well. We can't afford having people who do these jobs suddenly becoming unemployed overnight. It needs to be guided and supported at a policy level. But I'm convinced there are plenty of areas where we'll be seeing more robotics in use.
Are there any chores at home that you avoid, or ones you'd happily hand over to a robot? Just thinking about automation and the use of robots in the household.
Yeah, it would be great if all the housework, or if we could just have robots take care of everything at home. Not just me, all of us. To be honest, I'm not exactly a big fan of housework, let's put it that way. And yet, if we ever get to the point where a house could clean itself without human intervention, I'd probably be the first to place an order. No, I'm really not into household chores. So anything that can help automate housework, I'd be all for it. That said, I don't even have a vacuum robot or anything like that at home, not yet. But yeah, on the other hand, I'm also really not someone who enjoys doing chores in the first place.
Timo, you have also mentioned that you have 3 kids. What do you think is the best way to introduce children to new technologies? Or rather, how can we teach them to handle them properly?
Well, we definitely should guide our kids in their activities. What I don't believe in at all is shielding them completely or just letting them figure things out on their own. We as parents have to be involved in this process. That also means if I'm not interested myself, I still have to deal with it. That includes using digital devices or activities like gaming. Why so? Because if I exclude myself from all that, I won't be able to connect with my kid. Personally, I think that's not good. And on the other hand, if I engage with it, I can actually influence what's happening. Well, of course, that's not always easy. I know that perfectly well. I'm a father myself, and I talk to a 9-year-old about the games he plays from time to time. So sitting down and really doing that, that's tough for me indeed. But I have to do this anyway, and if I do, I can stay involved and also set some boundaries. And these are boundaries I probably couldn't set if I didn't understand the whole thing. And I don't even just mean screen time in this case, like setting a rule of 1 hour per day or whatever. whatever it might be. I also mean things like he's not allowed to just buy digital assets for the games he plays. I mean things like spending €10 so that his avatar can wear a different outfit. As a parent, I can help shape that. I can simply say, no, I don't want us to spend money on things like that, for example. But if I don't engage with the topic, I might end up giving my kid money without knowing what it's being used for. That's what I meant earlier in our conversation. So I have to understand what's going on first. Consumption habits and everything else. I constantly need to ask, do we really need this? And when it comes to that specific area, we, my son and I, decided no, that's not something we want.
Timo, now I'd like to ask you about global change and future perspectives. I know it's a topic you really enjoy. It's something you also explore in your podcasts. Over the past 20 years you've been working, there have been huge technological shifts, but the world as a whole has changed too. So what we're experiencing now, is it a drastic paradigm shift or more of a natural technological evolution?
We are always living in evolutionary phases. Life itself is evolutionary. When we look back at everything that has happened, we tend to say that not very much has actually changed. That's a bit how we view things in hindsight. But when we look forward, on the other hand, we massively underestimate what can happen over the course of 10 years. At the same time, we're overestimating what might happen in just 1 year. We have a really strange relationship with time, I must admit. Still, if you look back at certain things, the pace of development has become extreme compared to 300 years ago, and even compared to just 60 years ago. You can see it just by how long companies stay active on the market. The average lifespan of a company has drastically shortened. It's no longer 60 or 70 years, but more like 30 years. The reason is, time moves so fast that technology disrupts a company's entire business offering. But that's the business side of things. What really interests me more is the sociological, anthropological side. Questions like how societies are changing because of this. The example I always bring up in this context is the internet itself. As we all know, it has its pros and cons. On the positive side, there's an enormous growth in knowledge, and knowledge has become more accessible. But there's also a negative side to that, because nowadays people no longer trust what they know, and that's a societal problem. Especially when you think about fake news and similar issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are pros and cons, but we are exactly living through these phases, and it's important to reflect on where we stand. That's why I'm such a big fan of future studies, something we do far too little, to really engage with these questions. Where are we right now? How might things develop? And do we even want them to go that way? That's a question we don't ask ourselves nearly enough. I often get the feeling we just let things happen and then figure out how to deal with them. But we can actually shape these processes. Take big topics like the internet. That's what I often bring up. It's something we can influence, deciding where and how we want it to develop. And today, we'll definitely talk about artificial intelligence. It's the same kind of
definitely.
topic.
And what would you say is the biggest achievement of the last 20 years, if you had to put it into one point? What has influenced society the most?
Answering this question, I would definitely say it's the internet and everything around it, including social media, of course. Though I would rather put achievement in quotation marks, because there are still pros and cons to consider. But the reason I believe it has had a massive impact on society is that we now live in a situation, which I find really bad, where we don't believe what we know anymore. We should remember that democracies function only if we have a common foundation. What we think, the knowledge base, ultimately. With all these in place, it's possible to argue politically and socially about how to change things and how to achieve genuine transformation. But right now, and that's why I'm bringing up the internet and social media, because within the different bubbles we move in, this effect escalates until we simply no longer have this shared basis of knowledge on which we can then discuss political decisions and societal topics. No, we end up debating the facts themselves, and that's something where democracy simply no longer works. That's why I believe the internet and social media, as they exist and are used today, have probably the biggest influence on our lives.
And despite all these crises we are facing right now, no matter where you look, politically or socially, we see unrest everywhere. Yes, there are wars. There are more and more conflicts nowadays. And I also get the feeling that society keeps getting more and more divided. So there's definitely reason for concern. How do you personally see the future? Negatively or rather positively?
Both, actually. Fundamentally, I am, well, let me explain it a bit. I wouldn't label myself as an optimist or pessimist or anything like that. I think we're all a bit of both at the same time. I always try to maintain a somewhat realistic perspective, and I really mean exactly what I just said. I see both sides, actually, and that's really the whole point of future research. You know, there are worst-case scenarios, best-case scenarios, and everything else that comes with examining these issues. The psychological reason why I am engaged in this myself, why I'm so passionate about things like that, and why I believe we need to do this much, much more, not just in politics, but in society, in companies, and also on an individual level, is that when I think about the future and consider all these different scenarios, whether bad, good, mixed, or whatever, in that moment, I'm already privileged, because not everyone can do this. And I don't mean privileged mentally or anything of that kind. The thing is, people living in autocratic systems don't think in terms of a potential future, and very poor people don't either. They think about survival, actually, about what the next day might bring, so to say. So that's a form of privilege. The other is that when I think about the future, I enter a space where I have the ability to shape things. And in the end, that leads to optimism, because the moment I believe and know that I can shape things myself, whether as an individual or as a company, I automatically gain optimism, because I can influence things myself. That's why I have both dystopian and utopian scenarios in my mind. But since I know I can shape things on my own, maybe not everything, but a lot, it actually brings me optimism. Some people who know me might be surprised by that, because I do sometimes talk in a dystopian way. Of course, they might wonder why I sometimes talk about dystopias, but overall I can say for myself that a lot of optimism grows out of it.
Timo, since we have already touched upon the social structure of society, what do you think could really come in the future regarding work models? There are many approaches right now. For example, the idea of a 4-day work week, and some countries have already introduced basic income. What's your take on that? How will societal structures change in this regard, in your opinion, especially with an aging population? We're seeing more older people, and more work or value creation will be needed so that these older generations can receive their pensions. What do you think the work model of the future might look like?
So, first of all, let me start with demographic change. Demographic change is basically a future research topic. So, if I extrapolate all the statistics and facts that we have today, we obviously face a major social issue, no doubt, with the pay-as-you-go system, with pensions as such. Today, it's the case that 3 working people, I'd say, fund 1 retiree. That sounds awkward in this context, I guess, but with the pay-as-you-go system, it's okay to put it like that, and soon it might be only 2 working people funding 1 retiree. This is just an example of how demographics are developing at the moment. That means that something has to change, because I really can't imagine how the pay-as-you-go system will work the same in 7 or 8 years as it does now. I just don't see it. And there are a few things to consider in this entire context. For example, one thing you can often hear from conservative circles is extending the working life as a solution. I'm not against that at all. Personally, I have no problem with it, because I actually like what I do, and I definitely want to keep doing it when I'm 70 if I'm still healthy enough. I know that's also privileged. There are jobs where that's not possible, people doing physical work, for instance. It doesn't really make sense to extend working life if your knees are ruined from laying tiles or whatever. So you really have to focus on the specific professions when talking about this. But what I want to say is that all these developments kind of go hand in hand. I believe working life will be extended in some areas, maybe even on a voluntary basis. Well, I don't know. On the other hand, I also believe that in our parts of the world, not as a global trend though, the meaningfulness of work, the sense of purpose it provides, will gain greater importance. That wasn't the case in the 60s, 70s or 80s, and even today in some places it still isn't. In so many cases, we work to earn money, to be honest, but you hear from young people, from that aspiring Gen Z, that they increasingly demand more in that regard, and that can be fulfilled through work but also in private life. That's why work models like the 4-day week are being discussed nowadays. While they're counterproductive in the current system, as I have already said, all these developments go hand in hand. I can definitely imagine that in some areas a 4-day week will be offered. One more topic is the unconditional basic income. It's also not a new thing, it's been around. It was researched already in the 1960s and 70s, and also successfully researched back then. But I can't imagine, and I would really like it to be a political discussion point, which almost doesn't happen at all, that this is seriously discussed. At least in Germany. I'd like to see it become a real topic of discussion, because it also encourages people to actually think about it, especially when you compare the costs of a basic income against the social costs we currently have with all the social programs. Economically, it could definitely make sense, but I just don't see that conversation happening here, and that makes me somewhat skeptical, at least in Germany, that we'll see anything like this in the next few years.
Timo, I find it quite symbolic that we're filming this interview in a football museum. I know you also have a very close connection to football. Could you tell us a bit about that chapter of your life?
Yes, of course. I played football myself for quite a long time, right up until my retirement from the sport. Basically, I kept playing until my late 30s in various clubs. I'm also still a fan of VfL Bochum, so football has always been part of my life. If I count my time as a mini-kicker, I've easily played for almost 40 years, and these days I'm more of a spectator. I'm still a fan. I go to the stadium now and then, and my connection to the sport is there, and it's going to stay.
What did that period, when you were playing football, teach you? Do you see any link between the sporting drive you always need on the pitch and your later career, perhaps? Or what lessons from that time can you actually apply effectively in your work today?
Well, on the one hand, there's performance orientation in sport, of course. That's always valuable, because it gives you a way to measure yourself in competition, in the game and while having fun. But the biggest benefit I take from it for my day-to-day work is the diversity I have experienced within the team structure. Yes, diversity. That means different age groups, especially in the senior leagues. In youth football, teams are usually quite homogeneous in age, but in the senior leagues you get a real mix. I played as an 18-year-old alongside people who were 35, and as a 34-year-old I had teammates who were just 18. They also had different backgrounds, so everything was completely diverse, and learning to work with that in a team context, that goes beyond just match day, meaning in the locker room, and really getting to know these very different people you might never otherwise meet because you live in a certain social environment. I can say quite confidently that this experience had a huge, lasting impact on my life.
You once told me in a private conversation that back in the day, especially in North Rhine-Westphalia, there used to be these, I'm not so sure of the exact term, ash football pitches, and that you actually played on them yourself. These days they're pretty rare, right?
Hardly any left. They do still exist, but very few, yes. Red turf, as it used to be called. I'd say 80 to 90% of my matches were played on red turf, on those ash pitches. They were quite common in the rural area, but you could also find them in other big cities like Berlin, for example. It was a completely different kind of surface. Nowadays, that's also changed. I believe nowadays most pitches are artificial turf rather than ash, and most young players play on them, I guess. But when I was young, it was different. Almost all my matches were on those red ash pitches. Maybe in more rural areas or in Bavaria, you'd have more grass pitches. And whenever I talk to people from outside the region, some don't even know what that is. But it was definitely a defining feature of the coal capital, the rural area, sure.
I can imagine how your parents reacted when you came home. I bet they had no doubt you'd just been playing football.
That's right, indeed. Especially if it had been raining. As an outfield player, I actually had it easier. But the goalkeepers, now, those guys really had fun, because on rainy days they had to throw themselves into the mud. Their clothes looked fantastic afterwards, yes.
Let me jump over to the topic of sustainability for a moment. I think it's an important one in a broad context. I'd like to ask you this. Many people know the term sustainability, but few really understand what's behind it, because it's always very sector-specific. For example, if we talk about sustainability in logistics, that's one thing. If we talk about sustainability in everyday life, it might be something completely different. How is sustainability implemented in logistics, or what approaches are relevant there?
Well, the most discussed approach in logistics right now is the decarbonisation of transport. And this is quite natural because that's where most of the emissions actually come from when you look at the logistics sector. And that applies to all the transport systems we have, from trucks right through to airplanes. This focus makes perfect sense because, as I have already mentioned, that's the biggest share. If you break logistics down into transport logistics and intralogistics, the lion's share is in transport. Roughly speaking, logistics accounts for about 9 to 10% of total emissions, and of that, easily 90% comes from transport, with the remaining 10% in intralogistics. There too, you can find plenty of emissions. If you look closely, you will see that it's things like buildings, shelving systems, and the energy consumption of various pieces of equipment. And even with that, there's a distinction. For example, in cold chain logistics, as you can imagine, maintaining cold storage requires far more energy. If you dig into it, you will see these different breakdowns quite clearly. But the hotly debated topic really is the decarbonisation of transport. And within that, there's also what you might call perhaps low-hanging fruit, isn't the perfect term here, but at least in terms of timing, the area that can be implemented the soonest is the truck. With airplanes, it's much harder because we simply can't fly with a battery. That's not possible. We need alternative fuels for that. But with trucks, it is possible. And we're actually seeing it now. Either hydrogen, but the technology and the way things are shaping up, the truck has what it takes to prevail.
And if we now talk about sustainability in everyday life, what should a person actually keep in mind? Or how can they really integrate it effectively into their own daily routine?
Yeah, that's actually a tricky question. It's not so easy to answer, to be honest. Let me say one thing right up front. Nowadays, we are all talking about our carbon footprint. But if you look into where that idea actually comes from, it was essentially projected into the world by BP back in the day, in part to underline the power of the consumer. And of course, that was a clever marketing move by BP, also to distract a bit from where emissions are really generated. Yes, they do come from consumption too, no question at all. But just to give a bit of a preview of what the overall global strategy has to be, we simply have to stop burning things. Full stop. It's that simple. The average German is responsible for about 11 tons of CO2 per year, and we need to bring that down to about 2 tons. So a lot needs to be reduced, in fact, and the individual share is about 20%. That's where our power lies. I'll get to that in a moment. But 60% of those 11 tons come from the government and companies. Just to be clear, consumers do have power, yes, but not nearly as much as we're led to believe. What can people do under these circumstances? What can we do as individuals? Simply put, we need to burn less. And yes, in that context, maybe we should also consume less actually. Of course, there are a few other things a person can do in their everyday life. For example, if you need to buy a new car, you can consider electric mobility. If you need a new heating system or are building a new one, you might as well think about a heat pump. And of course, you can reduce flying as well. These are all pieces of the puzzle. I'm not trying to open a debate about banning things or anything like that. I just want to say, thinking a little about what you do every day, that's really the first step.
On the topic of sustainability, I wanted to dig a bit deeper and ask what's the difference between true sustainability and greenwashing. Because you hear a lot about projects that were considered green or sustainable, but in the end turned out to be nothing. And some have really tried to launder money under the guise of being green. How can this be effectively avoided?
How can it be avoided? Well, at the EU level, we now have the so-called Green Claims Directive, which aims to call out greenwashing. Let me just say this first, of course. You can think about punishing companies practicing greenwashing. I'm not really a big fan of punishment, though. That always feels a bit harsh. I believe what we really need is to help people understand some important things, and I always try to convey this idea in my daily life and work. We are currently in a transformation phase and we need to be humble about the information we share. So if we do something just for marketing reasons, that can definitely lead to greenwashing. And I always differentiate between greenwashing and greenwishing, because many companies do something hoping it will have an impact, and then realise, no, it doesn't. We have to be okay with making mistakes moving forward. There's no other way. But no one has the perfect recipe for decarbonising their supply chain or themselves. So we have to allow them room for trial and error. And that's what we should do. What's more, we should always communicate our results, so that others can learn from what we do. If a company claims something and communicates it externally but then realises it didn't work, that's actually very valuable for everyone else, because then they know, okay, we won't take the same path. That's not greenwashing in this case, because greenwashing is actually a deliberate act. Basically, it's fraud. And here, we also need to educate people. The fact is, sometimes people are tempted to communicate certain information, thinking it has an impact, and then later realise, no, actually, that's not the case. So if we communicate something for marketing reasons, we're quite quickly tempted to actually fall into the greenwashing category. And I think we need to put a lot more incentives in place, both as individuals and within companies. In this case, we will be able to report honestly about it. I personally do that quite often, but always with humility. And that, I think, is the key point. The moment certain actions get punished, we see the negative side of that. And by punishment here, I also mean the so-called shitstorm, which is exactly the trend we're witnessing right now. Because of this, something has emerged that is called green hushing, where companies simply stop communicating altogether out of fear of backlash. And that is a very, very negative development, because on the one hand we need to allow for forward mistakes, and on the other we have to share the information we have without fearing that we'll be ridiculed for it.
Timo, right now you can hear a lot of negative things about the German economy. Nevertheless, I believe there are actually many very positive aspects anyway. For example, I've observed that over the past 2 years, more than 50% of Germany's energy has been produced from renewable sources. For an energy-intensive economy like Germany's, that is truly an achievement. From that perspective, I just wanted to ask you, how likely do you think it is that the EU's declared goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050 will actually be achieved? How feasible is that goal, in your opinion?
Well, if you extrapolate today's statistics into the future, this development definitely doesn't look realistic. But we all know that we have a fundamental problem with exponential developments. Our minds just can't really process them properly. So when I look at the statistics, I mean in terms of renewable energy expansion, not necessarily the build-out, but where the electricity is coming from, you have just mentioned over 50% last year. There's another development that's also growing exponentially. Battery storage systems. Their costs are dropping exponentially, while the number of units sold is rising exponentially as well. When I look at all these trends together, and they are exponential beyond any doubt, and I know that I can't fully grasp in my head what that means. On the timeline, it makes me very optimistic, because once these developments reach their tipping point, they accelerate so rapidly that a societal transformation can happen very, very fast. In this case, I mean the energy transition, of course.
Timo, there is one more interesting topic that I'd like to discuss with you. So you once mentioned that you have also dealt with the topic of food. As far as I know, both on the personal level and in relation to the future and sustainability in the food sector. What general problems exist today in food production? And also, to build a bridge to sustainability and considering the growing global population, how can they be solved?
There are several factors. I once analysed this. Quite broadly, let's put it this way. Maybe not in full depth, but at least I was trying to identify the main challenges in this area. On the one hand, I want to make a positive statement first, but unfortunately it has a very negative implication. So today we actually have enough food, and money aside, enough food on this planet for 10 billion people. That means not only for the people living today, but also for those we expect demographically in a few years. By 2050, there will be about 10 billion people, so that's a positive message. The negative side is we throw away, well, not most of the food we have, but about 1/3, and that is obviously very bad news. Of course, there's a further problem to think about. Yes, food is distributed unevenly, unfortunately, but theoretically we have the possibility to feed everyone today. This can be arranged through better distribution and reducing food waste. That's possible. The big challenge in this area is food waste. We throw away too much. This happens on the consumer side, of course, but also across the entire supply chain. That means we need to make sure we throw away much, much less, and that's a challenge, no doubt. Or consume less, actually. This also applies to the food sector, and that's a big challenge, in fact. A second major challenge is linked to climate change itself. Where will food be produced in the end? We will ultimately see shifts there as well. Spain is a good example of this, or rather, good is the wrong word here. The places where tomatoes and oranges come from will face increasing difficulties. The problem is, they're moving into desert-like conditions. And that also means water consumption for the tomatoes produced there will increase exponentially, just to make it possible for tomatoes to grow at all. That's why, as a global society, we definitely need to think about these problems. These are huge challenges. Of course, the whole issue of supply and justice plays a role too. In the US, at least, there's the term food apartheid, referring to some areas, especially socially disadvantaged neighborhoods, where it's basically impossible to buy healthy food. But instead you find McDonald's after McDonald's, or supermarkets offering only convenience food. That means nutrition itself is also an important topic for society. I once came across a quote from a leading cancer researcher who simply said, "I'm afraid of sugar," like that. And the fact is that in almost all the processed foods we buy nowadays, not the fresh goods but the processed ones, there's more and more sugar in them, and that does something to the body. Diabetes is actually the biggest pandemic we have. One of the biggest pandemics, but it's not really discussed in the media.
Kind of a slow, creeping thing.
Exactly, creeping. Actually, it's a bit like a shifting baseline issue, and we have somehow accepted it. Yeah, we have more diabetes cases nowadays, to put it a bit sarcastically. So also the way we consume things. Oh, we have really lost the connection. And I include myself in that as a person as well. Unfortunately, most of us don't ask ourselves where the food on our plate actually comes from. We've been totally alienated from that. So we really need to reconnect a lot more with the question of where our food comes from. That is also a very important topic.
You work in innovation at Körber. My question is, where do you find your inspiration? Because, there are things you do routinely. Innovation is an area that really demands a lot of creativity. So what are your sources of inspiration? Where do you get new ideas from?
Not from my own industry, actually. It has nothing to do with logistics. I deeply believe that innovation is emergent. What I mean is there are some areas, some industries doing certain exciting things. So if I'm at a trade fair that has nothing to do with logistics, an event like this is highly inspiring for me. And in some way, I try to connect the topics I see there to issues we have in logistics. And that's how you create the phenomenon of emergence. So I always give the following piece of advice to everyone involved in innovation and looking for inspiration. Go to trade fairs in completely different industries, for instance. That's just one small example. So that's one source of inspiration. Another is, of course, books. Also magazines or articles, if you like. Simply continuing your education in areas where you first have a passion and second want to learn something new. Because exactly those perspectives, that learning of something previously unknown, leads to further trains of thought. And another source of inspiration might even be conversations you have with other people. Just expressing thoughts or exchanging ideas, and all this doesn't have to be public, like at some important conference panel. It can also be in a one-on-one setting where you talk about some topic and gain a different perspective.
Timo, to wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you one more question. What books would you recommend, for example, to those who are now interested in innovation, to people looking for some relevant reading? I don't know. What comes to your mind?
I can definitely give a lot of tips in this area. What comes to mind in the innovation space, and something I'm a big fan of, are the books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Anti-Fragile or The Black Swan.
He also has books for kids and teenagers.
That's true. So why these books exactly? Because this author has a completely different perspective on innovation, which is exciting. To be precise, he touches upon exactly that chaos and randomness I have already described. I experience this every day in my work when I talk to CEOs who expect that innovation can be planned, and I'm really talking about genuine innovation here, not the incremental kind where something just improves. That kind is definitely more predictable. But sure, when it comes to something new, something completely new, you cannot plan it. Things like that are highly random. The examples always given in the innovation context are exactly this. Post-it notes, for instance. Pure chance, nothing more. Or Teflon, also pure chance. These things give great insight into the nature of innovation. They're good examples of how such things came about in the past and that we should accept this reality. You just have to accept that. And he explains it extremely well in all the books I've read. So that's something I gladly recommend to anyone involved in innovation. And one more book which personally has somewhat changed my life is by Rob Hopkins. It's simply called What If? This book is just bursting with optimism, but this optimism has nothing to do with a naively rosy viewpoint. Actually, the author thoroughly describes everything I have also touched upon today. When it comes to creative possibilities, simply what is actually possible, what humans are capable of achieving, things that today, in the dystopian world we sometimes live in, we tend to categorically exclude. And this book offers really wonderful, yes, truly wonderful examples of everything that is possible. And I still remember when I was reading it, I thought to myself, I can change the world. And that is quite a big, how shall I say, a big thing that a book can plant inside someone, if one constantly carries this feeling. And this book does exactly that, and it does that wonderfully. And those two, I'd like to leave simply as recommendations.
I'm personally really glad that we're ending our conversation on such a positive note. I genuinely appreciate this discussion, and I believe our viewers do too. In my opinion, it was truly profound and insightful. Thank you, Timo.
And thank you for the invitation.